Hello, everybody. Hola a todo el mundo. Welcome to the second session of Artistic Ecologies, New Compasses and Tools, which is part of the program Education from Below. My name is Pablo Martinez, and I work at MACBA, the Museum of Contemporary Art of Barcelona. And with me today are my colleagues from the project, Emily Petrick from Rijks Academy in Amsterdam, and Anna Devic and Yvette Kurlin from WHW Akademija for whom in Zagreb. In the visible and invisibles are Anna and Martina, who are giving support to all the technical issues. We are very happy to welcome you all, and also to our guest, Max Jorge Hinderer. Hola, Max.
Hola.
Max Jorge Hinderer is a Bolivian-German writer, curator, and philosopher based in La Paz, Bolivia. From March 2019 to June 2020, he was director of the National Museum of Art in La Paz, el Museo Nacional de Arte de La Paz, where he founded the museum's program for the colonial studies in art, and was responsible for generating a historical change of the institutional profile. Max was asked to leave the direction of the museum in June 2020, when the conservative, almost fundamentalist, I would say, Janine Áñez was in power. Áñez was proclaimed president of Bolivia after the political crisis that ended with President Evo Morales in exile in November 2019. This crisis was in part consequence of new extractivist policies and practices in the region, something that proves how cultural fights have always a material background, how oppression of some identities or cultures, in this case, the Aymaras, is always part of a process of extractivism in what could be called a process of permanent colonization, as Mayan thinker Aura Cumes would say. The three pairs that give name to today's session, decolonize, democratize, deeliticise, or deelitize, no? Emily corrected recently, were three actions that guided the transformation of el Museo Nacional de Arte de La Paz. From the very beginning, or from the very first moment when we were preparing these sessions, the three threads proposed by Max for his work seemed very inspiring to us, the Education from Below team. Three fundamental concerns to rethink artistic institutions. As a collective project, Education from Below explores how art practices can dislocate traditional divisions between theory and practice, but also disrupt the conventions of who knows and who ignores, who are the experts, the amateurs, or the ignorants. Education from Below project focuses on how knowledge can be produced through mutual learning. On the top of the project, one of the questions, the question of emancipation, is crucial, understood not just as a matter of power, but in relation to freedom. Some of the questions that appears in our meetings that I think are related to this decolonize, democratize, deelitize, no, are I can share some of these questions. No, is what sort of knowledge make us free? What can artistic institutions learn from its constituencies? How can museums be affected by their audiences? Or how do we want to be governed as institutions? No? In this series, the series Artistic Ecologies, New Compasses and Tools, we are inviting different people to present practices, tools, and experiences that are in tune with some of the desires that prompted us to gather and start working together, such as speculate together about possible alternatives to the current state of the art world. No? Thank you very much, Max, for accepting our invitation. And thank you all that are following us in different online platforms. We plan today's session as a conversation, and all of you are invited to make comments and questions during the panel, as you did last week in the wonderful sessions that we had with Denise Ferreira da Silva and Valentina Desideri. As the session is being recorded, if any of you do not want or don't want to show your identity, please let us know when you write in the chat, no? When you post your question in the chat. Max, I think it would be great if you can introduce, or if we can start from the beginning, and if you can share with us a part of your experience of the National Museum of Arts in Bolivia, and if you can introduce the three threads of your work there, no? The colonize, democratize, deelitize, and why did you decide to start to draw this line to work in this specific institution and in this specific context at that time?
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation, Pablo, Emily, and the colleagues of What, How, and For Whom. It's really a great pleasure to be part of your series of talks and your project of education from below. Even though us living on the southern hemisphere, we're always, considered being somehow below or somehow matches in the imaginary. I'd like to draw attention to this. I'm right now in La Paz, and La Paz is pretty high up. We're on about 3,500 meters above sea level. So it's also education from above, if you allow me to say so. And on the other hand, of course, I'd like to thank not only you who made this possible, but also the audience who is participating. It is such a great thing. We can be all together from all these different parts of the world, despite the difficulties and the circumstances we find ourselves in globally right now with the COVID-19 crisis. So having that said, well, yes, what does it mean? What we see in the title, decolonize, democratize, and as Emily suggested, not elitize, but to say de-elitize. We're going to find the right word. It is, I think, symptomatic that there is no, there is no autocorrect that would make you a suggestion for how to write de-elitize properly. So this is also an interesting, let's say, historical condition we find ourselves in. And it proves that such concepts as de-elitizing are badly and urgently needed, because there's apparently no awareness. If we take the fact that our computer programs do not know how to handle the word, and ourselves are just making way and trying to find a way of how to deal with such a word, that proves, for my point of view, that we do need to think more about it, because it's a crucial concept. Now that you asked, Pablo, to tell the story from the beginning, well, first of all, I think it is important to understand that the conditions we have and the institutions we work at may be very different, varying the countries we live in, the cities, or be it that it's public institutions, private institutions, public-private, which was a successful model in the 1990s. I think you and at MACBA, you particularly know what that means, the public-private sort of neoliberal model, right? That was implemented. I think MACBA in that sense is a very paradigmatic case for a contemporary museum. But the situation in Bolivia is different. We can say that on one level, working at the National Museum of Art, it is of course a great privilege. It is no doubt the most important and representative institution for the arts in the Plurinational State of Bolivia, but it also shows that there's some basic contradictions. Not to mention public institutions always have a very difficult, and there's a lot of inertia in the processes of trying to organize culture, and so because of the public apparatus itself. So there is always, it's a bit of a more of a slow moving mechanism and organism compared to let's say private institutions, because of the public public administration. But on the other hand, we also see some basic contradiction between that Bolivia is constitutionally constituted as a plurinational state, but we're talking about a national museum of art. So there's one basic, let's say, contradiction that constitutes a lot of the basis from which on my work started in the museum. Just to give a general background for people who do not know Bolivia, Bolivia since, well, in 2005 had elections after very agitated years from 1999 on to 2003. There was first what we call in 1999 and 2000 mainly the so-called war on water, and later there was in 2003 the so-called war on gas. Both of these wars were broad alliances of social movements, indigenous populations, farming populations against the government and what you have mentioned, Pablo, extractivist politics. And in the case of the war on water, I don't know if any of you had the chance to see the film, a filmic interpretation with Gael Garcia, which is a nice film where you get an idea. Gael Garcia is you know, the handsome protagonist he is, and which tells the story about the war on water, which was basically the state or public government trying to privatize water in the region of Cochabamba, which is central in the Bolivian geography. And there was a large upheaval, large alliances between social movements, farmers, political movements. And that was a bit the beginning of what was a popular, let's say, from the people response to extractivist politics in Bolivia. Then in 2003, the war on gas was similar. It was about putting taxes on gas, international gas sales of natural resources as well. So the war on water and the water on gas constituted very broad alliances between social movements, political movements, indigenous populations, farmers movements, syndicalists, and which led after several renunciations of different presidents in constitutional succession, led to an election in 2005, at the end of 2005, which was won for the first time in the history of Bolivia and of South America by an indigenous president who is called Evo Morales. Evo Morales ruled, democratically elected and democratically re-elected several times for about 14 years. And with his movement called Movement to Socialism, Instrument for the Sovereignty of the People. That's the name of political instrument for the sovereignty of the people. That's the name of his movement. Movement to Socialism, Instrument for the Political Sovereignty of the people. Political instrument for the sovereignty of the people. However, Evo Morales, after 14 years, had certain difficulties to. No, wait. First of all, he got him into power in 2006. He assumed power in 2006, and Bolivia went through a radical change that manifests itself and expresses itself most prominently through the fact that in 2009 a new constitution was approved that made the Republic of Bolivia by majority, a two-thirds majority in parliament and in Senate, made Bolivia transform from Republic of Bolivia to the Plurinational State of Bolivia. The project that started right after Evo Morales assumed power in 2006 builded a council, a sort of assembly, a plurinational assembly, and the plurinational assembly rewrote our constitution since 2009, then we are a plurinational state. What does that mean? That does mean that Bolivia, when it was still a republic, basically functioned like most South American countries still function. That is, it is in large parts governed by the heirs of colonialism. That is, it is the white elites that govern in all of our Latin American countries. You can extend it to Latin America. And these people are usually coming out of stemming out of lineages of families that were already powerful during colonial times. So we're talking about the heirs of colonialism that maintained the republics. With the plurinational state of Bolivia, a historical change occurred in which for the first time the originary populations, indigenous nations, farmers nations, Afro-diasporic nations, and there's a whole, in the constitution, it's farmer, indigenous originary populations. It was a decision to call them not only indigenous populations, but farming, indigenous originary populations and Afro-diasporic populations that count 36 according to the constitution of the plurinational state of Bolivia. So Bolivia reassembles 36 recognized nations by the constitution, right? 36 farmers, indigenous, originary, Afro-diasporic nations. And so we are a plurinational state. And for the first time, actually, there is an active indigenous participation in the state apparatus that is in the government. So indigenous movements, social movements are actively being part of the government. That happened during those 14 years. In 2019, there were general elections, and after Evo Morales had to really force the constitution, to what was possible with every possibility that was left for him, and managed to get a juridical approval of being able to run for president of a third time. That is, it was actually a fourth time, but it doesn't matter. He was not supposed to be able to run again, and he forced the right and the juridical system to a point that he ran again for president. And then he had won the elections in October of 2019, but there were big upheavals, especially in the cities, the main cities of the country, Santa Cruz and La Paz, and Cochabamba, and there was a lot of struggle, there was a lot of pressure on the streets, and then the OAS, the Organization of American States, said that they had seen irregularities in the elections. There was the accusation of election fraud, and in a big turmoil, this finally led to the military forces, first the police forces doing mutiny, going into mutiny on a nationwide level, and the armed forces, the army, recommending publicly the rejection of the president. That is, they withdrew their support of the constitutionally elected government, which at that moment was still a constitutionally elected government, right? At that moment, when losing support from police forces and armed forces, Evo Morales, together with his vice president Alvaro Garcia, fled the country, and some ministers also fled the country. And then there was for 2 days, a sort of vacuum in which it was not clear how the succession would occur. And that is when Yanine Áñez, who Pablo you mentioned, assumed power on the 12th of November of 2019, being in a historical moment, historical because it was the first time for after the series of military governments Bolivia had between 64 and 1982. The first time a military in his war outfit, I don't know, de campaña, traje de campaña, no sé how you call it, like just, you know, his battle uniform would put her the presidential medal, and the militaries basically appointed her in a symbolic act, right, as a president. This military-backed coup d'etat government, because it was a coup d'etat if the military forces recommend the renunciation of a president, right? And with this sort of pressure, the president stepped back. This coup d'etat government under Janine Áñez, who was is a lawyer, she's in prison right now. I'll tell it later. She was a senator during Evo Morales' government of the opposition, and in Senate she was something like the second vice president of the Senate. That was her position as an opposition, a person from the opposition, and she had very often manifested herself publicly in racist ways, right? So she's an openly racist person, just as was her government. And with the whole movement that destabilized, it was a neo-fascist movement that destabilized from civic forces the Bolivian government of Evo Morales, a constitutionally elected government. However, there were episodes that were clearly of a racist nature, like burning the flag, the huipala, the flag that represents the Andean populations and became symbolic to represent all indigenous populations in a way. So burning indigenous symbols. When Janine Áñez came into the presidential palace, she carried a huge Bible in her hands, and this Bible she held up high, and then her comrades, like a fascist leader from Santa Cruz called Fernando Camacho, these people who are Christian fundamentalists, they would come and say, white, I didn't mention that, they're all white people, they would come into the palace and with the Bible and say, we're going to, I don't know the exact word in English, but in Spanish, it's extirpar, which was the word that the Spanish colonizers used, you know, to rip off the indigenous deities when in the 16th century they invaded the Americas. So the same vocabulary of the colonization, these coup d'etat invaders into the presidential palace used to say, we're going to extirpar la Pachamama del Palacio de Gobierno, we're going to rip out the deity of Mother that represents Mother Earth from the palace, and we're going to put instead the word of God, which is the Bible. So this was the government of Janine Áñez. What this government, which was based on political persecution, massacres, there's been several massacres in which the army killed many people. Again, indigenous populations and social movements on the countryside, rather, or on the periphery of the big cities. So it escalated a sort of racialized division of the population, and an old ghost of the Cold War came up, which is that of, you know, the big divide between left and right. And I have to mention, I have lived in Brazil before I moved to Bolivia. I'm Bolivian, but before I moved here to assume the position as director, I lived in Brazil, and I lived the coup d'etat against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil too, which had several similar aspects on it. One of the things that happened after Dilma Rousseff in Brazil went down from government and Michel Temer assumed, who was a neoliberal and he was her vice president, but was to cut down cultural institutions, both in Brazil and in Bolivia. Sooner or later after the coup d'etat, they would shut down the Ministry of Culture and they would significantly intervene into the rights of indigenous populations. So the situation of rights of indigenous populations would be cut down and the ministries of culture in both countries after the coup d'etats would be cut down. This is something that I think can be considered symptomatic for this new right that in Brazil led to the government of democratically elected, it's fair to say, government of neo-fascist government of Jair Bolsonaro, which is openly racist and sexist, and it also legitimized civil forces in Bolivia that are armed civil forces that are violent and that are openly racist and sexist and use fascist symbols. Actually, there's a big fraction of Bolivian fascism that is the Croatian fascist front in Bolivia, which is also an interesting connection which exists between our countries. And so you have the Spanish colonizers and the Croatian fascists. However, the situation was pretty bad, and it was not only bad for the population in terms of heavy repression and military occupations of the street, but also for cultural institutions. So after a certain time, this government that had come into power through this coup d'etat, military-backed coup d'etat, supposedly would only have to stay for 90 days in order to organize new elections, but they postponed and postponed and postponed the elections because of all kinds of reasons. Then the COVID pandemic came up in March of 2020 and the lockdown, and so they stayed for a whole year until, because of the pressure of the social movements, finally they gave in, had democratic elections, which the movement towards socialism, the political instrument for the sovereignty of the people, won with a new candidate, Lucho Arce, and David Choquehuanca won with over 55% of the votes, and with almost 27% of distance to the next political force. So it was a, it was a contundente. It was absolutely. It was a huge victory of the elections that showed where the people stand. So after this year of interruption, which cost jobs of many were persecuted. Many of us have friends or family members, partners that were persecuted, had to leave the country, went into jail. It was the coup d'etat government at some point launched laws that would prohibit free artistic expression. So it was especially journalists, artists, and bloggers that were included in this supreme decree that was worried about causing confusion because of the COVID crisis. So one way to basically censoring the liberty of expression and free speech in journalism, internet, and arts was a law that foresaw that there shall be no confusion disseminated regarding the COVID crisis, right? But because of this law, over 80 people were arrested and so on. People fled the country, as I said. So it became a moment of severe fear. And I was lucky. I only lost my job, to say it like this. I could stay here and well, lost my job. I was warned before that many times to not use the word decolonization because it was considered to be ideologically polluted by the government before, right? And so still, when the coup d'etat government came into power at the museum, we continued with our program for decolonial studies and created, as a matter of fact, one of the very few public, let's say, safe places where one could speak out about these topics: decolonization, democratization, de-eliticization. And even though Maria Galindo, who's a very famous colleague of mine, she's an anarcho-feminist member of the collective Mujeres Creando, Maria Galindo was stopped after coming out of one of the events by the police. So we were, like, there were police standing at the doors, and, you know, it was kind of, apparently, it was known that something was going on in the museum, and the police would stop people after coming out of the event and, you know, ask for their credential, their IDs and so on. So Maria went through that experience. That's where I know it from. However, this is a broad kind of background. So
because it's a national. Can I ask? Because you were saying this is the only safe space, but how was that? How did you make that?
The only what? Sorry?
You said this is one of the few safe spaces where people can come and speak. And
yes.
Stuff, but how did you do that within the context of a national museum?
Well, we just made our public program, and well, people, the then still president of the Cultural Foundation, which is the matrix of institutional matrix, told me, like, don't say the word, don't say the word. And later, when he was kicked out and the right wing reactionary forces took over, they also didn't like the word. It's funny. Then after I had to leave the museum, one person who is part of the cultural elite of the right-wing elite of the city of La Paz took over as director, and she continued the program. The program actually continued, but for some reason, the reactionary forces would tolerate this if it comes from the right mouth, that is, if from someone who makes part of you know, the right-wing conservative elite, even if she's not entirely right-wing conservative. However, it was okay to keep on this discourse. It changed a bit, of course, but when we started it, it was more, let's say, politically motivated, obviously, because, and now I'll come to to speak about decolonization, democratization, de-eliticization. The idea was that if you would like to decolonize a museum, just on a very basic level in the context of Bolivia, and I think this applies to probably everywhere, but in Bolivia it's particularly evident. In order to decolonize, you need to democratize and de-elitize, because otherwise, you know, that's just what a decolonization consists of, right? So if you want to decolonize, you will have to go through process of democratization and de-elitization. So our banner was a graphic that showed, you know, decolonization, to decolonize is equal to democratize equals de-eliticize. And the power of this slogan, let's say, was that it would still pre-coup d'etat, it would entirely, upset the cultural elite, which was the cultural elite of the Republic of Bolivia. As I said, it was the heirs of colonialism, which would themselves speak themselves, of being proud of belonging to traditional Spanish families, would be proud of, having family trees that go several hundred years back and be like a literate white colonial elite that survived the Republic and was the elite of the Republic and continued being the cultural elite. So what is the special thing about visual arts we all work in? Visual arts and plastic arts, visual arts was after 14 years of, a government of the first indigenous president, after 14 years of a government that implemented a plurinational state that would recognize 36 originary indigenous farming Afro-diasporic nations on their territory, and in the constitution give them the same rights to everyone. After 14 years of having this new constitution, visual arts was the last residue that was the last domain of the heirs of colonialism, right?
Yeah.
So the National Museum of Art was the last place where they had, kind of gathered and which they would still consider theirs.
Because
they would still consider.
Can you tell us a bit about the collection of the museum and the art that were displayed in the galleries?
The museum was founded
in the colonial painting. It was only colonial painting or painting from.
The museum emerged from a city government institution that was a cabinet of colonial paintings of one of the most famous colonial painters, Melchor Pérez de Holguín, Bolivian painters, a colonial painter, and it was a kind of a cabinet of his works in a colonial building, one of the most beautiful, I have to say, colonial buildings, and also recognized as, as an Andean Baroque architecture on a global scale. In this building that is at the main square of La Paz, that is like 2 houses from the Palace of Government, like in the middle of the political center of the country, is this museum, and it was founded in the 1960s by the by members of this elite. It was after we had a revolution in '52, which was also supposed to be a left nationalist peasant revolution. The revolution of '52 brought an ideology of 1952 brought an ideology of mestizaje, like a mestizo identity of mixed identity of indigenous white people. But the whole concept of mestizaje was an ideological Republican fake story. It's like in Brazil, they say, in Brazil there is racial democracy, but it's a complete fake. Everyone who lives in Brazil knows that it's a complete fake. And only in music videos and some Europeans who would like to travel to Brazil think that in Brazil everyone is equal. And same in Bolivia, like the idea of a mestizo population was ill from its very beginning. And the ideology of the revolution of '52 that assumed that there was a white Creole elite, a white mestizo elite that would represent the mix of the originary indigenous populations and the Spanish populations and the European invaders was just wrong, because obviously the people in power were all white and came from these elites, and non-indigenous people really participated in these processes. And so when the museum was founded, soon the director, which is very often considered but not technically right. However, the mother of the museum was actually also the founder of the art history, let's say, in Bolivia. She was an architect called Teresa Gisbert, a very bright, intelligent, and great researcher who made a sort of inventory of colonial paintings. So the collection first in the museum was about colonial paintings, but over the decades acquired more and more 19th and 20th century art, that is art of the Republic and of Bolivia. And nowadays the museum has a collection of about 9,000 items, and the largest part is actually contemporary and 20th century art, like the large part, like 70% of it. So the number of colonial paintings is in relation relatively small. Still, it is because of the building, and because of the imaginary of the people, and because of the directors that have been in the museum since the 1960s, that are all people, with one exception, were all people that made part of this cultural elite of the Republic, that were all proud of their Spanish heritage, of the colonial heritage. Because of those directors were part of these groups, the identity of the museum in the public opinion and in the imaginary of the people is very much linked to the colonial collections. But actually, Emily, yes, actually, just
quickly,
let me finish the
I'm
sentence.
curious about what was in the contemporary art or 20th century collection. Is that like Bolivian or Latin American, or?
With the exception of one collection we got the museum got as a gift or a donation, that has concrete and abstract geometric 20th century Latin American art, Brazilian, Argentinian abstract geometric art of the 50s, 60s. With that exception, everything is Bolivian. And that has a simple reason, that because of the public administrative apparatus, it is very difficult to acquire pieces, and it is more difficult to get international pieces. So it's a thing that really needs a lot of struggle in order to be able to, you know, build the administrative bridges that would make it possible to buy international art. So that is a problem. So the collection consists of almost exclusively Bolivian art or colonial art. There's one interesting aspect about colonial art, also the narrative of art history that is proud of the colonial heritage. Does not speak of colonial art, it speaks of viceroyal art because of the viceroyalty of Peru, right? And so it's not the colonial art, it's viceroyal art, which is another form. However, when I, just to close the circle, when I arrived at the museum, I didn't even start. I was just presented as future director beginning of 2000, I think it was January of 2019. I spoke of decolonization, and soon people in the public, you know, white women of age with big jewels hanging around their necks and big earrings would stand up and would, you know, get all upset, saying, so I pretend, what I pretend to do is to burn the colonial paintings and destroy the colonial heritage as a process of decolonization. I have replied to that accusation at the moment. I also did, saying it has nothing to do, but I But I replied in a newspaper article. I write essays for a local newspaper called La Razón. In one essay, I replied saying that 500 years ago, in an act of legitimate self-defense, it might have been a really good idea of the original indigenous people to just kill all the white people that arrived and burn down everything they brought with them. That would have spared them, 5 centuries of extractivism, genocide, rape, whatever makes part of the system of colonial violence. It might have been a really good idea, undoubtedly, but today we have to think of it differently. And my opinion is that decolonization is based on changing our perspective on art, right? So if decolonization consists in democratization and de-elitization, first of all, if we are in a public museum that accommodates and protects the patrimony of the Plurinational State of Bolivia, first of all, we have to understand that it's a patrimony of a certain nation, if you like to speak of plurinational, right? It is a patrimony of a certain people, and it was functional to certain people. And however, even if it was only of certain people, we still have to understand that the National Museum and the patrimony it holds is the property of all Bolivians, right? So if there is a national museum that is the National Museum of the Plurinational State of Bolivia, then the patrimony belongs to everyone, to each and everyone, and make people understand that it is there, like the people's house, it is the people's museum, it is the people's patrimony, and it's the people's art. So the people, in an act of, let's say, cultural mediation, could find a way to relate to it. Now, we have to assume that 36 nations, originary, peasant, indigenous, Afro-diasporic nations, do relate to this art in a different way than the white elite of the Republic of Bolivia did, right? So decolonize, democratize, diseliticize, kill all the white people and burn what they produced is today, I think, not the best idea, because first of all, it's the patrimony of all the 36 nations. Second of all, these paintings very often serve as the only testimony we actually have of those times. And these colonial paintings, to speak about colonial Baroque paintings and the Baroque paintings, these paintings are the only sources for us to understand how colonialism really worked. Very often these paintings were painted by indigenous painters. As a matter of fact, most of them were painted by indigenous painters. Even if in the end a European master came and set the last dot in their workshops, it was indigenous painters that would do the largest workload. And so, as I like to say, if we would make a trial, if we do a trial on reparation, if we would do a trial on historic justice, then we would not invite these paintings as the accused people, right? We would invite these paintings as testimonies of what the time of colonization was. So I think first step in order to decolonize is to study the colony, to understand how the colony operated, and that we have to do with the paintings. So these paintings certainly do not provoke the same reaction with the visitors of the museum or with all the people. It's just a difference to whom you show them. And also historically, we have to understand that many of these paintings were actually made in order to provoke fear and to implement fear in the indigenous populations, and not the impression of beauty. So we need to understand that these paintings had a function, that they were functional to colonialism, to the colonial mechanism and a global economy. And in order to understand how colonialism really worked, we need to understand the paintings. So destroying the paintings would be a very bad idea because it would deprive us of some of the most valuable testimonies we have of that time. So we need to make them accessible, right? In order to decolonize, we need to democratize. What happened? Please interrupt me with questions. If Zoom doesn't do it by itself, you may interrupt me anytime. So we need to make them accessible so people can learn from these testimonies, right? We need to do a proper communication and mediation work with these works in order for people to have access and to understand that this is not the source of their identity, but it is cultural expressions of a genocidal government that invaded our territories. And in order to democratize, you need to de-elitize. Okay. So you need to build down one of the most effective mechanisms of colonialism, which is built down a wall that was built up and that is properly represented by the walls of the museum and the doors of the gates of the museum. But it is a wall that is built inside the minds and the sentiments of the people. So a lot of people actually don't think that they are allowed to enter the museum. They don't think that they should enter, or that it would be accurate they enter the museum. Let me explain you. The museum, National Museum of Art in La Paz, is on one that has its main door to the corner of the main square, but also to a pedestrian street, which is populated by many street sellers, which almost all of them are from Aymara origin, one of the 36 nations, and the nation that is whose territory here, the place of La Paz is of the Aymara people. So a lot of them are Aymara speaking, don't speak properly Spanish, and they sit there on the street selling stuff like woolen hats or belts or whatever kind of little objects on the street. And these people have their children in a school in a public school next to the museum. So this street is populated with Aymara people. And once we realized, when we did the guided tours in Aymara, I'm going to speak about that later, but we realized these people, once we started speaking to them and inviting them in, we realized that these people actually never thought that they were supposed to enter the museum. So the biggest obstacle is one very effective mechanism of colonialism that inserts into the head of the people that segregation, is valid.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, Max? I'm
yes,
curious
please.
About how did you build trust in order to be able to start to create dialogue or exchange or bring the elitize?
How would I build trust?
How did you create the dialogue or trust that was, or the kind of bring down the barriers that were preventing people from coming?
One of the, I think, most successful two things probably were first of all doing guided tours in Aymara, which would which were free, free of charge, and they would bring people who would speak Aymara. Now, people who speak Aymara and in that context usually come out of people who speak it fluently as a mother language, come from a different social sector than people who usually visit the museum, which usually tend to be white, middle, upper class. And so by offering visited tours, guided tours and guided visits at the museum in Aymara, we would bring a completely, entirely different public into the museum. We would offer them free entrance, which is a factor, a decisive factor, which also by law you're not allowed to do because you're a public institution, so you have to charge. But by doing events, you can make free events. So we had to do these events of the guided tours, and then we could get these people into the museum. Hello. Do you hear me? Do you see me?
Yeah, everything is okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm trying now with a different network. I hope this works out. All right. So excuses for that. The trust, right? Emily had asked about the trust issue. Well, one thing was the guided tours in an originary language that would attract a completely different public that was out of the usual public of the museum. And the second was to do the program of decolonial studies and arts, in which we would raise these questions. We would say, what does the question was of our first talks was ¿Qué es arte?, which is what is art? And it was based on a very simple assumption that in languages like Aymara or Quechua, which are the most spoken languages in the context of La Paz and El Alto, there is no such a word as the European imperial languages share, like art, that everyone would, you know, we would kind of understand what art is supposed to mean, even if we perhaps do not agree completely, but there's a common sense about what art is. However, in Aymara and Quechua, you would not have these words with that kind of common sense. So by doing events that where we would invite Aymara Quechua people, for example, or Afro-Bolivian people, for example, or urban indigenous people from El Alto, or those iconic Chola figures, right? To speak about what is art in their communities, in their context, in their languages, we would start to make clear that the museum is not the place that would impose a colonial definition of art and of aesthetic experience, but the museum would like to expand its notion and would like to have an understanding of what, you know, the National Museum would like to have an understanding what a plurinational notion of art could be. So by putting a term such broad as art into question and do it from perspective of originary nations, such as the Aymara, which is the strongest present here in the La Paz context, we would obviously gain some, I would say, trust with the Aymara people, with them recognizing, okay, we're not going to be ran over by some definition of something that white, cultivated, erudite cultural people, you know, understand. But we can come here and we can actually, and this was nice about the guided tours in Aymara, the question, what is art, was very central. We had the historian, an Aymara historian from the community of Pariti, an island of the Titicaca Lake. He is called Isaac Cayisaya, and Isaac had to deal a lot with you know, different interpretations. So basically everyone who came in the audience and visited and the guided tours in Aymara was authorized to give their own interpretation of what art could mean, right? So it was a moment of self-empowering. It was a moment of asking what I think is a crucial question within a colonial context, post-colonial, if you like, context. And these were some of the strategies, I think, probably the most important ones.
And also, Max, if I understand well, you have you work on access and also in the public program, but in the exhibition program and the display of the collection, you work in order to incorporate these threats.
Yes, again, now public administration is very inerte, como se dice. It's just a very, you know, kind of slow and delayed form of apparatus. When you start thinking of something, you very often need to go through many steps and temporalities of public administration until you get where you actually want. So I was only as a director for 15 months until I was put away by the extreme right government and the reactionary cultural administration. So I did not have a lot of time to do exhibitions, let's say. I think one interesting probably example is, I didn't prepare any picture of this, but I can see if I find one.
There is also a question from the anonymous member of audience asking, apart from the concept of art, did the process of decolonization also change the concept of the museum itself?
It did in the sense that it tried to renew a public, and from a progressive point of view, progressive in terms of museum politics, I think one should assume the public as constituent of the museum as apparatus in itself. So by changing the public and the perspective of the public, we would also in some way change the museum. In another way, the contradiction I mentioned in the beginning of the contradiction between national museum and plurinational state, we softened that contradiction by trying to be the museum, or let the museum become a place where other perspectives on art that were not the nation of 52 or the nation of the Republic of Bolivia, were not the hardened notions of this colonial heritage, but we tried to soften the contradiction by letting in new notions, like, for example, what does art in Aymara mean? It could mean those things that are made with the hands, for example, as a literary translation, and through that we enter in completely different ideas of how to display works of art and understand what could be considered works of art and what not. At the same time, also in many of the 36 originary languages we have in Bolivia, the word like I, first person singular, doesn't exist, or not in the same way as in the European languages. So the idea of authorship is also completely different within these different nations, right? Because you do not have the individual author genius and perhaps something that is collectively made with the hands by the people, which might be one process of cooking a meal, or which might be weaving something with several hands, you know, might be within the frame of what we consider art and what we consider should be exhibited. But again, the temporalities of public administration are very slow and delayed, and you usually plan things with 1.5 years ahead. So you might imagine that the implementation of this block of thinking of what we were creating collectively, because obviously we were creating it collectively, by talking about it in public events, by visiting exhibitions that were already installed. Put this into practice takes a long time. So there were very few exceptions. What we did, however, is when I started, we started changing completely the expographic kind, the displays, the logic of the displays. So one of the basic things, for example, talking about colonial art, was to exhibit paintings in a way that you could always see their backside, referring to all the invisible processes that are usually not visible and that are covered by the institution walls, which is very symbolic, right? The institution walls, like the museum walls, are not only the barrier that segregates racialized people from white people in entering the museum, symbolically speaking, but the museum walls are also the ones that cover up half of what you can see from a canvas, which would be the flip side of the one that is painted, which often is also painted, or which reveals historic processes of how it was made and so on, what fabric it is painted on, if it's wood. And then again, it gives us an idea about the origin of the fabric, because such a thing, a painted canvas with a frame in the Bolivian context has to be seen as a very complex process in which many different indigenous populations might have been involved, from the cotton to the weaving of the fabric, producing the textile where it will be painted on, etc. Where does this come from? Where does it is it imported from? Also, La Paz is on the, how you say, it's just where on the edge of the high plateau, the Andean high plateau that stretches from La Paz to Peru, like from the south, even from the southern part of Bolivia to Peru. So it's a huge high plateau called the Altiplano. And here there's a very arid fauna and also very limited access to materials. So many had to be imported. So to produce a painted canvas, how it is in the end in the museum, is a very complex process in which we only see one side of the one face of the coin, or however you say. So we decided to not take the museum walls as symbolic support, not take the museum walls as an display support element, and we decided to make it a topic. What is the invisible part of the visual art that we are appreciating? What sort of invisible elements are constitutional for us to see what we see? And colonial violence is one of the invisible parts that we often don't see on an image that is considered beautiful and shiny, glittery even, but it has a backside, right? It has a hidden history. So we did change the museum in the logic of display and the disposition of the museum of being of learning instead of dictating or imposing. For this, we had many elements. One of the main things that changed was our communicational strategy. So we would start to make people understand that the main mission of the museum was to strengthen culture in one of its most marvelous functions, that is culture in a plurinational state, different than the Ministry of Law, which would guarantee equality of everyone. Art would have the magic power, and culture has the magic power of guaranteeing the difference of everyone by securing equality, like equality through difference. So what we always said is that the main function of the museum is to strengthen the unconditional right of everyone to equality, and at the same time, the innegotiable right of living in difference. That was our slogan. So we did change the museum by giving it a social function that went beyond, let's say, to cultivate or colonially educate uneducated people. Yes. So I'm talking and talking and talking. Please ask me questions. Otherwise, I just go on.
There is another question from no. Thank you for organizing this talk. Very precious. Just wanted to paste the press release of Amsterdam Museum regarding stopping using term golden age. So, but I cannot click the link. I imagine that is a problematic term, no? Golden age, that is related to colonialism and the.
Yes, well, the Dutch, Emily, perhaps you would like to say something about my experience with Dutch people. Is limited, even though I did spend quite some time and learned to know a lot. I went to Hoorn, to the Museum of the East Indies Company, which is one of the main pillars of Dutch colonialism, and it might be problematic with the Golden Age because of the reference of all the gold that was robbed and stolen, and that this is considered a shiny time. But I'm not the Dutch person. Emily, perhaps you would like to say something.
And Anna wanted to say something, no?
Yes, I had a question about some of the strategies that you perhaps had on your mind to be applied to the museum program, but you didn't have a chance to put at work. So if you would like to share with us some of these strategies that unfortunately you were not able to develop, and what kind of methodology or approach thought of, maybe perhaps related to education or to inviting someone from contemporary art to deal with this situation. So more curious about that.
Let's start by the end. Contemporary art is a critical term here in Bolivia because of two reasons. Because of three reasons even, seen from the perspective of administration. There's the problem that it is very difficult to invite international people. As a public Bolivian institution, you don't have a chance to buy a plane ticket for someone to come from abroad. You actually don't even have it for some Bolivian person. But however, this is a problem with contemporary. So you always have to find ways, build structures external to the museum, find co-financiers, however. And in Bolivia, the term contemporary art is very little used, and that is because the few art institutions there exist in La Paz, in Cochabamba, university faculties, or in Santa Cruz and El Alto, and these the term contemporary art is not very well received. In for example, we have an Academy of Fine Arts in La Paz. The model that teachings there follow and educations there follow is more a kind of 19th century craft concept of art, and conceptual art, or not conceptual, contemporary art is considered kind of the enemy because it is considered to be craftless, right? There's no magic, no art, no craft behind it, and contemporary art is just some rich people with computers, and this is what in in many ways, contemporary art is considered here in Bolivia. So as a matter of fact, dealing with young students or people who just came out of these institutions here that have these 19th century models, people would have heard for the first time talking with me what contemporary art is. You know, art students that came out of art academy. It is so. There are professors that have open wars going on against whatever contemporary art they consider to be contemporary art. But this is the other problem. So you have, on one hand, contemporary art on an international scale, you have administrative problems. On the other hand, you have in the artistic educational institutions, huge prejudice against contemporary art. And then people who defend contemporary art are usually rich people with computers. So what is the problem about that is that this again is, it has a huge classism about it. And people who defend contemporary art are usually very elitist, even if they say that contemporary art is much more democratic or whatever. They do step into a trap and into a false assumption that people who have never had any experience with whatever you consider contemporary art might just, by being confronted with, I don't know, the Fountain of Duchamp, to use the most, whatever example, you know, would suddenly come there and say how beautiful this work of art is. It just doesn't work like that, right? You need like decades and decades of art educational and institutional work for a person in Middle Europe, Central Europe, who has a materially secured background and knowledge to arrive at the museum and be able perhaps to interpret a work of contemporary art without a previous art education and on a higher level. In Bolivia, this is just not, it just won't work. It just won't work. So people who defend contemporary art usually have a class problem, which in Bolivia is automatically a race problem. And this is why contemporary art is a critical term. I don't say one should avoid or exclude contemporary art from a museum. On the contrary, I think one has to make it accessible through educational programs, but also just as one possible version of art. As I said, we're living in a country where there's 36 different possible translations of art that have nothing to do with art in the European context or in the Eurocentric context. So contemporary art could just simply be one aspect of possible manifestations of art in a museum.
And Max, talking about 36 other definitions of art, I don't know if you had a chance, given that you were there short and everything that you talk about the administration, to start working on transforming the collection. And how would you go about it if you had a chance in terms of including the different epistemologies, the art that was not actually created for the museum, which is also, there is a tricky question of appropriation and how do you deal with a art like that? How would you work, or how would you approach the collection problem?
It is a very difficult problem because of, let's say, restitution issues, right? There's a big problem with restitution, not only in colonial countries or post-colonial countries with, you know, what was robbed from our territories, our cultures, and brought to European museums. But there's always a problem of internal restitution. That is, that nations that do not identify themselves with the political center, which is La Paz, or people from communities on the countryside may, and this has happened very often, ask to restitute works that were made in their region or community or whatever, even Christian art. Or so this might always happen as a problem, like the problem of restitution in terms of how to build a collection. Then there's there is one interesting thing that is the whole language issue, like it's a semiotic issue, because it's also a colonial configuration of what is considered art. So there might be things we get as a museum and we cannot simply get it. You know, you have to go through a whole administrative procedure of a council of the Cultural Foundation of the Central Bank of Bolivia having to approve a donation. However, they might simply not approve any donation. But if they do, then there's the problem of what is already settled as the vocabulary you use to archive works, right? To integrate them in the collection. And probably some pieces we would like to include as works of art. We don't have an author, you know, there's not a technique. It's just not foreseen within the structure that was given, that is a colonial language of, you know, definition of elements that make out a work of art, so that you actually get into administrative trouble because your progressive thinking does not match the limited colonial language on definition of artworks that would allow you to integrate a piece into a collection. That might be another problem. And then there's such things on the positive side. The idea, and since I arrived here, I've worked closely with an old friend of mine, old colleague of mine, who's from Quechua Aymara origin, from the community of Cacachaca. She's called Elvira Espejo, and she's a brilliant artist, storyteller, weaver, poet, singer. She has a kind of a different approach on art. She moves through very different arts. And Elvira is now again, she was also destituted together with me, but she started working again at the National Museum of Ethnology and Folklore called MUSEF here in La Paz. And we've been, actually the question, what is art? It was the beginning of the program for decolonial studies we started in the National Museum of Art, came out of a dialogue we had with Elvira and the Basque curator and writer who lives in Rio de Janeiro, is now artistic director of the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, Pablo Lafuente. So Pablo, me, and Elvira would be talking about this, you know, this intranslatability and so on. So from the very beginning, I did work with Elvira, and Elvira has very interesting approaches in the, you know, whatever ethnological museum in La Paz that has to do with producing works. Like not only looking at artifacts that are historically relevant because they're old or they come, let's say, from far away, but she would work a lot with living communities that produce works of art. Then with Elvira, we also agree on the fact that in a plurinational state, you cannot just maintain the same colonial difference and the colonial gaze on a difference between what is supposed to be art and what is supposed to be artesania. What is artesania, Pablo?
Craft.
Do you know?
Crafts, no?
Crafts, yeah, crafts. So, so one has to go dig deeper into these very formal problems that exist, administration, administrative language, and the definitory power of a colonial language we still use to categorize art. So it's a very difficult process, and it would need a lot of time. Most of all, it would need, and this is also something that in the Museum of Modern Art did not happen very often, we need to work with people from these 36 nations. So we would need to include them into the team. We would need to, I just speak now in first person plural. I'm not the director of that museum anymore, but one would need to get these people into the staff, get these people into positions where they can take decisions and do research on a recognized level. It is not necessary to mention that the whole academic system is also a colonial system, and that hiring someone at the public institution again requires certain bureaucratic procedures that a person that comes from a community on the Andean High Plateau just doesn't count with, does not even have a school, you know, a primary school license or whatever, you know, like, so the administration is a big trouble. Administrative issues is a big trouble. That we still use a colonial language that is not capable of grasping the concepts that define the cosmovisions of the originary people of our territories is another problem. We're still using colonial languages to try to explain something that is probably not explainable in Spanish, right? And so these are major issues that would really take a long time and long, arduous processes to get to the utopia of making the National Museum of Art become a plurinational museum of art.
There is one question from the audience. Aldo Ramos, how is the living collective memory included in the museum? Are other worlds included in the curating of these memories?
Well, it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful. I'm not entirely sure what living memory means. We had one wonderful, who is now the director of the cultural department of the Cultural Foundation of which is the institutional matrix of some of the most important art institutions and cultural institutions in Bolivia. He's called David Aruquipa. David Aruquipa is not only the first man to fight and be successful for same-sex marriage in Bolivia, but to be recognized legally, but also he worked in the Ministry of Culture when it was still Vice Ministry of Culture many years ago, and he fought very hard for what is the immaterial patrimony. This is considered, what is immaterial patrimony and how you can secure immaterial patrimony, which is the closest which I right now can think of like living memory and museum. So immaterial patrimony would be certain practices, be them historical or contemporary or changing through the times. How can we, create markers and standards in order to recognize immaterial patrimony, which is something like living memory, if you like, and make it and protect it as we protect other patrimony that is of material nature. So there has been attempts of doing so. In the museum, obviously, you would, invite people to make ceremonies or invite collectives from communities to perform. This would fall into what in contemporary art museums in Europe or in the US would rather be like a performance kind of part. I imagine it like that. We did have these sort of rituals inside the museum or ceremonies, or I don't know if I got close to what the question was wanting to know.
Max, we also have one question that was posed on Facebook Live. And it is from Magaber, and it reflects on this plurinational character of Bolivian society. And the question says, Max, can you give some examples on the 36 definitions of art in Bolivia? So this kind of different.
Right. Which is very complex because, you know, you need to speak the languages, or you would need, you know, people who speak the languages to explain more in depth. The closest I came, also because I live in Aymara territory, I had to do a Aymara course. You kind of encounter Aymara in the streets and so on. And I do have Aymara friends. It is kind of the closest. There's different possible translations of what art could mean, right? So there's not a word for art, right? So Isaka Yesaya and Elvira, who are the two persons who I've been more in depth talking about it, particularly Isaac, since he was doing the guided tours and wrote the text for us at the museum, wrote the text for the museum. So you need to first of all find possible matches within Aymara vocabulary. So for art, since there's not the one word that you would just, you know, one-to-one be able to translate, like arte and art, or in German Kunst, or I don't know, you would need to find words that you could somehow interpret as art, right? So this will happen in every of the languages, that you basically have a dictionary, and you have to, you know, literally, like symbolically speaking, you have a dictionary and you have to go through till you find words that kind of, you know, could match what art is. And then you have, these words might be expression. In Aymara, works a lot with expressions. So one word can change according to with what other word it's combined, and it might change its meaning, basically, right? So then you can start first with saying you have one expression that says things that are made with the hands, right? This is one example that is very popular to work with in order to refer to art, because it describes what, you know, we have said for in the example of crafts, pottery, weaving, or so. It would, you know, relate to producing and to the production. So art is described through the way it is produced, let's say, mostly with the hands. But parts of this expression, again, might mean different things. You know, if you start with beauty, you know, beauty the same word might in another context mean death, right? So it's psychoanalysis will love this, but you know, it's just very difficult, because you basically, and this is something very interesting. We need to be conscious about. It is something first time I read in a text of Félix Guattari, the French, talking about psychoanalysis. That's how I came to it. Like the founder of schizoanalysis, the French philosopher Félix Guattari, who would speak that one of the, in the book he co-wrote with Sueli Rolnik, the Brazilian psychoanalyst and curator and philosopher, the book Micropolitics. I think it's called, in English, it's called, it has a different name in English.
Micro-revolution in Brazil?
Yeah, molecular revolution in Brazil, exactly. Yeah, molecular revolution in Brazil. In this book, the first chapter is on culture, and it's a talk Félix Guattari gave in Brazil, edited by Sueli, this first chapter. And he would write about and this is something that we met with Isaka Isaya, the Aymara historian. We worked at the museum together. That one problem of this translation effort is that is European culture and the notion of art and culture in Europe and in European languages, in the culture, let's say in the living process of culture, actually has a lot to do with separating arts and culture as a semiotic universe, which means that art production is separated from all other spheres of life in a very radical way.
Yeah.
So disculpa, Pablo?
No, que sí, que sí, que sí.
Que sí, sí. And so in European tradition, art production and cultural production is radically separated from all other spheres of life, creating an own semiotic universe, which makes it impossible for languages and cosmovisions like Aymara, where the possible notions we could use to translate art are not completely separated from all different other spheres of life, right? So how can you make a translation from a context where art does exist separate from other spheres of life into a language where the words you could use are multiple and are transversely connected to all collective processes of a community, from cooking to weaving to bathing to, procreating. So it is a very tricky thing, to try to translate. So what you would always have to do is to find the people you can work with and with which you can give them the power to decide how they would retranslate it into the museum. And this was the original plan. So let's say we take Isaac and Elvira, two Aymara friends I would trust in their work as, creative work and creative processes, and they shall, retranslate into something that the Western and Westernized subjectivities would be confronted as art. Because one thing is try to translate art into Aymara, but the other thing is whatever you find in the Aymaran context with, as I said, transversely connected to practices that are not as separated as art is in the European context, how can you retranslate that into the museum context? And the question, do you have to install a whole Aymara community to live a month, in the museum facilities in order to have something that you could extract as a possible definition of art or representation or materialization of art that can, in a dignified way, be presented in a museum of art? So it's very tricky and very complicated. But I believe that decolonize, democratize, and deeliticize is very tricky and complicated as well. So that's what we'll have to do.
Okay, thanks, Max. I think that, I don't know, Yvette, if you want to say something.
Oh, there is one more question from the audience. I don't know if we have time to take it.
We could do the last.
Yeah, I think.
As the last question, maybe. It was very obvious that you had a difficult mission, but what was the response that you have from the community? It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative.
Well, there were different responses. I was actually, well, first of all, there was a conservative right-wing community that felt in power over the cultural institutions and the museum, including the museum in Bolivia and particularly in La Paz. They would simply find it, intolerable. Then I was very surprised that of this cultural elite, there were many, more liberal kind of minds that would be very open to these sort of discourses when they were presented in a context that they would accept. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this right. Since the museum was very exclusive, and art institution, contemporary art institutions or modern art institutions in Bolivia are very exclusive in their social context. One way that the project of decolonization was trying to succeed in these institutions unsuccessfully was by bringing kind of some sort of folklore festivals into the museum, you know, like bringing things into the museum that the artistic community would reject, because it was just taking it and putting it inside the museum, be it you know, expressions of indigenous communities, or be it like real, like cliche folklore activities, which again can be really fun and nice and wonderful, but they would be just put into the museum, understanding the museum as an empty container that can be filled with whatsoever you put inside it. So one of the struggles I had, or during my tenure, my equipo, my team had, was to say publicly. We made a press conference and everything, and said the museum is from now on going to stop to be an empty container that people will just fill with whatever stuff and take it out and then put the next stuff in it. But the museum will stop to be a container in which a practice of representation takes place, and it will transform itself into a laboratory of analysis. So we will inseparably, with what we put in, we will make an effort of analyzing it. So let's say that the liberal contemporary artistic scene, which is all middle upper class, or almost entirely middle upper class white, would accept, because often these people have studied abroad or whatever, and be it that talking about the Rijksakademie, for example, or so, right? Like, which one of these institutions that attract a lot of international people, or have studied in the US, or me, I have studied in Vienna, right? So a lot of these people, which are more liberal-minded, but still within a very exclusive middle upper class segment of society, and very exclusive with their artistic presentations, or like unconsciously involved within the rigid segregationism of classes, societies, classes, colonial societies, these people would somehow accept it, rather when we would bring whatever sort of folkloric expression, or be it an indigenous community output or expression into the museum, if it was connected to an analysis that was, you know, for them sort of accessible. So from the more liberally minded artistic community, young artistic community, there was astonishingly for me, a positive response, even though there was sort of safe distance that the traditional contemporary art community and my tenure at the museum had. As I said, we had a lot of new public, indigenous public in the museum, people of lower income strata of the society that would have never thought they should or would be allowed to enter the museum, would come into the museum. So they would be very happy to just be included, right? So this is also a reaction to just be, you know, thankful of being invited in. This is the most beautiful of all reactions, of course.
Maybe that's a nice point to end, since it's nearing 9 o'clock here in European time.
All right.
But thank you, Max.
Yes.
It's been really brilliant to hear about the work you were doing, and it's such a shame that it couldn't progress for longer.
It will. Thank you for your words. I think it will, because it's without wanting to, you know, like seem to like self heroizing me or so, whatever. It was a collective effort in the museum. It was not only me. I was director of the institution, and certainly it didn't happen before, and it was, you know, the fresh energy I brought, perhaps also a certain ingenuity with which I said, you know, this must be possible, so let's do it. That made it possible that the whole team of the museum and many collaborators, you know, worked on this. But it certainly made a difference, and it made a change. And this change occurred. People saw it, people liked it. And I think that this was just the first step, and it will go on with or without me, and hopefully again with me at some point. But there are certain changes, like the plurinational state brought with it a sort of emancipation of the indigenous population at the moment of being recognized of equal citizens. This has, you know, made people stand up for themselves. And once you make this possible within the art context, you probably are starting a process that is just not simply going to, you know, fall back into itself, but the seed is planted, and I'm sure it will grow and flourish.